Welcome to the Cinematologists podcast. I'm Dario, and down the line, of course, is my good friend Neil Fox. Neil, how are you doing in the lockdown situation?
Really enjoying it, I have to say. I know that sounds mean and cruel, and there is a kind of a big tinge of guilt at saying that, knowing the situation that so many people are in. But it's been really positive for me. I've had a very nice time to reflect and think and write, and done lots of writing, and just kind of get my mental house in order. So feel very grateful for this kind of moment to stop, and obviously to have a job that allows me to do that. So while I do empathise and sympathise with so many people around the world, it's actually been a really useful period of time. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar thing, and sort of being self-reflexive about our positions is kind of an interesting thing now, because it's like the two luxuries are a permanent job and a bit of space. If you've got those two things, you're kind of set up, and there's nothing really to complain about, which is why I kind of haven't. You know what I mean? It's just a case of dealing with what our jobs are, which, you know, in the grand scheme of things, are not by any stretch of the imagination dangerous jobs or anything like that. We're not on the front line. I mean, you know, in academia, it's got its own problems, which we'll probably mention at certain points. But yeah, just that idea of being sanguine about my own position and situation, and then acknowledging at times, I think, when I've felt like, you know, I've had ups and down days where I feel like, oh God, you know, like an afternoon where I was thinking to myself, I just can't do anything, and sort of burying myself in bed, or just going to watch a movie just to kind of get away from those feelings and thoughts. And they kind of happen, but just sort of, carrying on and doing what I'm doing. And a bit like you, trying to do some writing, trying to think about other projects, thinking a lot about what next semester might look like in terms of teaching. Those are interesting and important questions that I think are going to come to the fore in the next few weeks. But mainly thinking this week about this episode.
Yeah, episode 100.
Yeah, for sure. And it's and 5 years, of course, we're talking about. So
Indeed.
It's like and you know, I mean, as listeners will see in the structure of this episode and the content, there's a little bit of self-aggrandizement going on here, but I think we've kind of we're earning that, and even if people think we haven't, tough, we're going to do it anyway and just sort of enjoy the moment, because I think, you know, without a doubt, just sort of framing the episode, it's the Cinematologists podcast has definitely become central to my life in an academic sense, but also just in a sort of cultural sense and in a friendship sense with you. It's sort of, it spans across everything, and you know, I can't put a level of significance on that in an adequate way, I don't think.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same. And it's definitely something I'm very proud of. And in terms of the milestones, but also just in terms of the experience and how it's kind of grown and evolved. And just been a really, really rewarding experience from day one, really, which is really kind of amazing considering the last, you know, everything that's happened in the last 5 years. So feeling very, very grateful. And I think it is important to kind of to reflect on that in a positive sense. And it was so nice to ask sort of people and friends of the podcast to, you know, if they wanted to contribute, and to get such a kind of array of responses, and to know how people engage with the podcast in a really intimate way, rather than just the odd tweet or the odd email. You know, it was a really, really lovely kind of affirmation of everything we've been doing, and hopefully people will enjoy those contributions as we get to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to let people know that we did sort of ask various contributors and the Patreon subscribers if they did want to record a little segment and ask us a question that we can talk to with regards to anything, really. I mean, it can be about the podcast in the broadest sense, but also individual films. We were quite open to anything. I mean, obviously with the COVID situation, we had other plans in mind, but they were sort of shelved. And you know, we wanted to do something that maybe was a little bit different to just watching a film. I mean, we could have picked something that we both really, really loved and wanted to talk about. But I think we wanted also to have that opportunity to have a bit of a dialogue with our listeners. And anybody who wanted to take us up on that in their own personal situations of being locked down, it was a nice thing to do, and I'm glad that we got the responses that we did, and some interesting topics are going to come up, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be a really fascinating episode in terms of reflection, but also kind of thinking forward and thinking about what's next for us and for film, I think, in a much broader sense. So should hopefully be a nice balance of the reflective and the projective, if that's a word, which I'm going to pretend it is.
Okay, no, absolutely, it definitely is. So who are we going to hear first, Neil?
Well, first up, we're going to hear from Ellen Cheshire, who, as she mentions in her contribution, was a guest on the episode for the piano that was hosted down in Falmouth. And the questions that she asked will kind of set us off nicely in terms of getting this kind of reflective conversation underway. So this is Ellen Cheshire's contribution.
Hello Dario and Neil, this is Ellen Cheshire wishing you a very happy 100th anniversary. I had the great pleasure of spending an evening in Falmouth at the Poly with Neil in September 2018 now, where we screened the piano to a group of incoming students and then had a fascinating discussion with them. And of course, revealing that for most, let's say all of them, they weren't even alive when the film came out. So I felt very old, but learnt so much from them as the discussion continued. So that's what's great about the Cinematologists, is that, despite now watching films and writing about films for 20, 30 years, I'm still learning, and that's what's so great about you two guys. Keeping it in the family, you can also hear my mum asking a question when Dario visited Chichester University with the film Her. So I have spread the love of Cinematologists across my family. But if I had to pick one episode that I do point people to, firstly, it's one of your bonus specials back in 2017, November, when you interviewed Alex Barrett about his film London Symphony. It's a really fascinating insight into making the film, which is a silent city symphony in the style of those from the 20s, but also about crowdfunding and how difficult and time-consuming that is. So that's the one I would kind of point people to if they haven't checked that one out. But I do have a question that I've been wanting to ask you ever since I started listening back all those years ago. You get the title, The Cinematologists, and who designed your fabulous logo? So again, wishing you both a happy birthday, and I look forward to hearing many more Cinematologists in the future. Bye.
Thanks very much to Ellen for her contribution and continued support of the podcast. And in response to those questions, particularly the one about where the name comes from, you prepped a little something, did a little bit of research for us to kind of really kind of clarify where the name comes from, because it's a question that we get asked a lot, I think, and it's a little known area of kind of film studies.
Well, you suggested it, and I think probably, if I'm right in thinking that you suggested it just in terms of it being kind of like aesthetically or linguistically quite interesting as a name. Is that right?
Partly, yeah, but it did have a kind of connotation that I was interested in. Well, two things. One was because it came out of my study of when I was doing my doctorate and kind of looking at the history of film studies and the film education, and realizing that it was quite a kind of controversial name, which kind of the rebel in me liked kind of bringing something from the past that had been almost discredited and kind of trying to resurrect it. And the other reason was that the part of it, which was this kind of scientific approach to film interested me in a positive sense, in the sense of like not accepting that science is a fixed thing. You know, like I think it's often thought of as once it's in a scientific mode, that's it. Whereas for me, science is something which is a constant of evolution based on what new knowledge is brought to the fore.
Yeah, so that fits in nicely to what I was going to say. So in film studies history, there was this Society of Cinematologists, which was founded in 1959 by a guy called Robert Gessner, NYU, and sort of various luminaries in film studies, which I don't think was really fully formed as a discipline, even at that time. Certainly within the context of a university education, it wasn't. And it had people like Siegfried Kracke was an early member, and, you know, a sort of, again, leading luminary in sort of formalizing the idea of film studies. And they had this society and built the journal around it, the Journal of the Society of Cinematologists. And as you say, it was controversial because it was this attempt to bring film studies into a scientific discipline, probably as much to give these academics credibility as much as anything else. But then in the late 60s, as the humanities became more to the fore again as an accepted discipline. It seemed, obviously, film studies kind of fits in with that. And then when Gessner died in 1969, the council of the society voted to change the name to the Society of Cinema Studies. And then that remained the same all the way through the kind of 80s and 90s. And then in 2002, the name changed to SCMS, which is the Society of Cinema and Media Studies, which, of course, many of our listeners will be familiar with. So again, I think it's what's interesting that you said there about the sort of scientific element of it, that maybe there is a correlation there that maybe we didn't sort of deliberately thinking about in terms of the idea of where cinema is now in the digital age. Is it the same as it was? Is it now? Is it recognized that cinema is kind of like as a definition in flux as much as it ever has been? And again, that was kind of Gessner's intent, I think, to sort of define cinema. But for me, and I think for both of us, this is a sort of project without an end, isn't it? You know, you can't ever get to the point where you say this is cinema, and sort of engaging with that in this era where we're fighting for that status, and to just sort of talk about the importance of cinema still. You know, it kind of fits in with that a little bit, I think.
Yeah, no, totally. It was, kind of largely instinctual in terms of what we actually thought the podcast was going to do, because we didn't really know at the time. But it was we definitely felt like that there was a kind of value in it, which was just felt, and we definitely align with kind of, I guess, taking it seriously in terms of its consideration and what it is, and not ever thinking we're trying to fix it or define it, but to just kind of constantly kind of extrapolate and kind of build layers of our understanding of it, which I think that's definitely borne out. You know, the amount of new cinema and different cinema that we've encountered in the last 5 years, and how constantly re-centered and re-understood what our own position to cinema is in terms of how we think about it and also how we experience it, I think it's just shifted so dramatically for me in the last 5 years. It's been amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And she also asked there who designed the logo, and that is Philly Blumel, who is a lecturer at Falmouth and a really fantastic illustrator and designer. And yeah, she was an MA student, and at the time when we started the podcast, and she worked in the coffee shop down the road from me in Falmouth, which was Providore, which was such a lovely one of the things I most miss about not living in Falmouth. And we just got chatting, and I sort of looked at some of her stuff at an exhibition and thought, I think there was something about the kind of the Soviet modernist way that she was kind of approaching her illustration and design that I thought, and that was the sort of brief I gave, kind of, think Eisenstein, think Vertov, think kind of 1920s modernism, and that's what she came up with. And it was just like, that feels good. And it, again, like the name, it's done a lot of good work for us over the last few years. So we're very grateful to Philly for her contribution. Yeah,
it's actually a big part of it. I think a big part of the show, that recognizable logo that we've got. And it's what's great is she gave us so many files with different versions and sizes, and we've been able to sort of manipulate it to each situation we needed it. So it works on the sort of big desktop, and it works on Twitter and all that kind of thing. So it's great, and really really grateful for that.
Yeah, and it was nice to send her the clipping from the Observer recently, where they printed a little version of her logo. She was very pleased about that. So that was nice.
Great.
So in the conversation there, Ellen mentioned one of her favourite episodes is the bonus episode with Alex Barrett, which was really nice to hear. And just realise how deep some of our listeners go with the listening. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that later on in terms of how people engage, and to know that some people literally listen to everything and find sort of their favourite moments in places that you would least expect is really, really rewarding. But we thought it'd be a nice now to lead into our contribution from Andrew Pearce from The Curb, all the way over in Australia, who talks a little bit about those kind of extra features for the Patreon subscribers. So I guess we'll head to him now.
Hello Dario and Neil, it is Andrew here calling all the way from Australia, sending huge congratulations to you both on your 100th episode. And look, I've been a huge fan and champion of the Cinematologists for a while, and I need to say that this is one of the most essential podcasts out there, and I don't say that lightly, because every time an episode appears, I just have to devour it straight away. I absolutely love the deep consideration that is given to every single discussion, ensuring that the listener is part of the conversation rather than being spoken to. It's a difficult balance to get, and I think you both have really managed that perfectly. I'm always in awe of the immense breadth of understanding of film history and the place that cinema has in the world today that comes from the discussions on the Cinematologists. It also is a valuable celebration of how important the voice of a filmmaker is, and there is such a deep consideration and understanding from you both and the guests that you have on the show who understand the perspective of a director, of a writer, of an actor, and the place that that particular film has in their society and the society at large. It's not an easy thing to grapple and deal with, but the cinematologist manages to do that on a tangible and easy to approach level. For me, having both of your voices and the many other guests on your show to listen to, and that has taught me a lot on how to talk about and engage with film, and has set a benchmark for me as a critic for what I want to attain as a writer and somebody talking about and discussing film. The inclusivity of the Cinematologists is wonderful. I cannot thank you both enough. I'll always be thankful that you took the time to have watched and record an episode on Sweet Country and dedicate the time continually to discussing and exploring international cinema at large. I know how hard it can be trapped in a bubble and only looking in your own backyard, or even just at American cinema as being the only cinema or film that you actually engage with. And it means a lot to have you both and your guests on the show discussing and exploring international cinema that's not just from their home country. It shows that there is a world of cinema out there that is worthwhile exploring and discussing that isn't just what we're familiar with and comfortable with. And for me, I have a long list of filmmakers and films that has been discussed on the Cinematologists that I have either tracked down or I need to track down and find out about and follow up on, because there's so much great film and cinema out there that isn't getting discussed on a wide, large scale. And we need voices like you both and the guests you have on the show talking about these smaller films that don't get a wider platform. It means so much. And given the state of the world at the moment, I also want to touch on based on that, as a Patreon supporter, and I'm really glad to get those Patreon newsletters in. It's really, really lovely and touching to be able to see how you both engage with film, what you've been doing over the past month. It feels like a conversation with us, and you're reaching out to us and extending warm regards to us. It's genuinely touching. I love it a lot. I've learned so much from the Cinematologists particularly, I love the episodes on film philosophy, and I've listened to them a couple of times, taking notes and having learnt a lot from them. And there are more than a few episodes which I've listened to multiple times because it feels like a great lecture or lesson in film and a journey that I really enjoy going on. And you feel like we're going on a journey with you and learning about films, and there's discoveries and discussions that take place that is so welcome and eye-opening that I just love it a lot. So often it feels like the world of film criticism feels like a competition, like other opinions or views are more important or more correct in inverted commas than others. But there's something welcome about the Cinematologists where it feels like anyone can be a critic and everyone's views are valued. And that is what I love about this show. And again, so I want to say again, congratulations to you both on 100 episodes of great and valuable film discussions. And I want to leave with one question, which is, as people who talk about cinema and film, I'm curious for you both, Dario and Neil, what was the critic or the person who talked about film that encouraged you on this path of exploring this side of film discussion? Where did you kick off your journey as a critic or as a person who is interested in film history or the nature of film discussion? I'm curious about that. Once again, thank you so much, both of you, for the fantastic show. I love it a lot. I've rambled on a long time, so please feel free to edit this down. But from Australia, I want you both to know how much I admire the show and I really value every episode that you put out. Congratulations, and I look forward to the next 100.
Thank you, Andrew. A lovely contribution. And thank you for introducing us to Sweet Country, which was a fabulous experience.
Yeah.
And a lot of stuff there in terms of the extra bonus content, which obviously only a select handful of people might listen to or read. But I think that we both feel like that extra content has brought a real value to the podcast in terms of just our practice and our reflection. And you made some nice points about the newsletter, which is our monthly kind of communication with our Patreon subscribers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the newsletter just sort of does serve, for me anyway, a kind of, in some ways, the recommendations part is a way for me to kind of create this cultural and artistic footprint, that the stuff that's influencing me, the stuff that is important to me in this, mad haze of information and stuff that you have to kind of wade through. I mean, you're probably going to speak more to the kind of curatorial function. I think that's really important, but just the ability to be able to say, yeah, this is what I'm watching, this is what I'm listening to, this is what I'm reading, and to find connections between those things is really been important. And it's, sometimes I can be a little bit random with that. I need to watch this, I need to watch that. And I often have this conversation at home. It's like, there's so much out there, but you end up scrolling through stuff, or what shall I read next? And it all seems to be a bit nebulous at times. And I think that having the recommendations part is really important in kind of finding a way through that. It definitely has helped. But then in terms of the sort of writing part, there's the idea of having a space where you can write something and reflect on areas that are unbounded by any particular context of what's going on right now. So you can write about something in your own life, you can write about something that's going on in culture and society, but also the fact that it is going to an audience, but it's not going to it's just not going to everyone. So there's a sort of selected audience who are there reading that and having that ability to be able to sort of maybe say things and expand your arguments in ways that you probably might not do, or it allows, I suppose what I'm saying is it allows a little bit of leeway in terms of something that you could put out there in a framework that is not maybe complete, that you need it to be more complete if it went out, say, in a journal article or just to the wider public online.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a specific space, isn't it? Yeah, which kind of does a lot of different things at once, which I think has been really rewarding. There is the curatorial aspect of it, and I guess it's kind of, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there, where you're not just throwing it out. You're sharing things that are meaningful to you, knowing that people are going to read that, and whether they take stuff off is not really the point. It's, and it's nice when people sort of do get back to you and say, check this out and it was great, or read this piece and it was great. But it is more about, kind of not just holding that stuff in and finding a place to kind of reflect. I love the fact that it's monthly or bi-monthly in terms of when we write our main communication before the recommendations, which is a reflection. And there's something nice about having that deadline and that focus. And a lot of my focus around the month is what's happening in my life that I want to reflect on at the end, making notes and what has felt really significant in terms of how I felt or what I've seen in the world or culture or at work that feels like something I want to unpack and I want to share in that space, which, like you say, is a good space where there's going to be an active readership, but it doesn't require the same level of research or kind of fear of putting it out in terms of judgment that a journal article or even a magazine article or a review might. So it's like everything on the podcast, really. It took a while to understand what it was for us, like a newsletter is a newsletter, but we've kind of approached it the way we've approached the podcast, which is, what can it be? What do we want it to be? And it feels such a rewarding part of the month now in terms of writing and reflecting. I feel really appreciative that it has an audience and that people respond to it.
Yeah. And it's funny, isn't it? It's because whenever we sort of float something, there's always in the back of our minds, have we got time to do this? Is this just going to be another chore? And that's the thing I think with the podcast we've kind of had to guard against, because there's been moments, I think, maybe where we've tried to put too many on. And again, it's interesting because this is the 100th episode. I'm always kind of thinking, there's people who put 2 podcasts out a week, and there's us with our 2 podcasts a month. And is it really worth celebrating 100 episodes because there's so many more out there? But in a sense, I think it's that the way that it fits into our lives is very significant, I think, and therefore that's why, and the way that we do it in terms of the depth of preparation and planning, and then the depth of care that we try to take with the edit, and then the research that goes into the content and what have you. It does take. Hopefully people know we aren't just sort of sitting down and winging it anymore. Maybe we did that a little bit at the beginning, but it's definitely not the case anymore.
Yeah, I think winging it is probably too negative, I think, in terms of how we approached it. I do think we were exploratory and instinctual and were led by our gut and our hearts of like, what are we interested in, and then being reflective on it. And I think that served us well. And there have been moments where we've kind of questioned the identity of it, or questioned what it is and how we do it and stuff. But I think that's been really, really productive in terms of getting us where we are, which is where it does sit at the center of our lives as a creative enterprise. But we're much more comfortable with knowing why we're dedicating so much time, and why it's important to take that time every month to do all those different things, episodes, bonuses, newsletters and things like that. I think just we understand it more from doing it so much. So that's why, again, it feels nice to stop and reflect, because I think it gives us another chance to do that, and realise that that people have come with us that whole way, which has been really nice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then Andrew also sort of talked about this idea maybe of alluding to it, this idea of film criticism as becoming kind of a competition, and a sort of battle of a battle of ideas, but in a kind of narrow sense that I'm right, you're wrong, and that's that idea of I have an opinion and it's in stasis and it's formed, and therefore there is no questioning of it, is far too prevalent, especially in this day and age, and something we probably try to rail against quite strongly. I mean, just over the last couple of days, I know you've been off Twitter, but I've kind of fallen into a little bit of a Twitter spiral, especially a couple of days ago when this article came out about There Will Be Blood. But I think we're always trying to address someone else's opinion with the sense that it's given in good faith. There isn't an agenda behind it, and I think that's that's the way I feel about sort of taking somebody particular. I mean, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but taking an opinion that perhaps I don't agree with, but it's like no, but the person is acting in good faith in terms of they're having that opinion. So where does that come from? And especially when it's you or somebody else I kind of respect, it's like, okay, so he's not saying that just to be a dick. You know what I mean? It's like, where does that come from? You know?
What was the There Will Be Blood thing?
Oh God, you don't want to get into. So basically, there was this article was written in the Guardian by a film critic. To be honest, I mean, again, I should have looked this up, but I didn't really think we'd be talking about it. But it was an article that basically was from a female critic who was writing that There Will Be Blood was the film that all her previous boyfriends, or a lot of her previous boyfriends, had told her to watch. So she watched it and she thought it was crap, so they were all wrong. You know what I mean? All right, I'm paraphrasing, and it basically sparked a lot of Twitter debate, really, on in various levels, which was quite, actually a lot of it was quite interesting, and it went in lots of different directions. It made me think in lots of different ways, so it had a positive impact. But it was funny how that I think it raised a lot of argument, because to me, my criticism of it was, it did seem like there was a little bit of bad faith in there, where it's just like, here was a critic waiting to say something that was going to be controversial in in this way that is, it seems to be that ilk of film criticism was done in a sort of deliberate, calculating way to stir up a Twitter storm, and it worked. So she's done a good job, the writer.
Indeed, yeah, and it's not like that sort of thing can't be done really kind of cleverly and smartly and critically. I remember that great piece a few years ago, it was like the history of Quentin Tarantino films through men I've dated. So this woman kind of reflecting on what her boyfriends had, but it was not about the films. It was about the a masculine cinephilia in that kind of way.
This was, I think, this was what that was attempting to be, and I think the people who liked the piece said that's what it was. But I mean, I think there was a sense where it does get to a point with any of those things. It's like, why are you listening to the men? Why just watch the film that you want to watch?
Yeah,
you know what I mean? It's like, nobody's gonna.
There, yeah.
I'm gonna take responsibility for my own film watching, even if 1,000 people tell me to watch something. When I watch it, it's my responsibility still.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, like you say, but then the sphere that goes out into is so different to, what that kind of would have been. Because it's kind of reminiscent in terms of egos and agendas of, like, Kale and Saris, kind of warring, but the audience for that, it was so narrow, and so analog, letters once a month in a publication rather than and I think we've talked about this a lot, but it feels like that kind of lens that it gets absolutely refracted through instantly, it just blows it up.
I mean, I think the thing that was interesting to me was how many freelancers were just like, oh my God, there's so much great film writing out there. Why is that in the Guardian? There was it seemed to twang a nerve, particularly of freelance writers who were very, very serious about sort of film criticism. And it's like, this was it's part of a series that clearly the Guardian had, commissioned, that they were going to put on, and it was doing what it was, it had a specific intention in that sense. But I kind of understood that. That there is so many people who will put a lot of effort into, quite sophisticated film criticism, and I think,
and that just takes all the oxygen up, doesn't it? Which again kind of goes back to what we're trying to do, which is to not add fuel to those kind of fires and do something a bit different.
Let's move on then.
No, it's not. But it's all in that, isn't it? Because it's just, we just don't, and we're all guilty of kind of falling into those rabbit holes and arguments, but because we're human beings. But definitely that's not our agenda, and it's nice that Andrew kind of gets that, as much as so many of our listeners do. And then he asked who was the critic or person who inspired us to go down our kind of path of film analysis, film criticism, film writing. And you've got a nice list of academics from your kind of formative years.
Yeah, I mean, this was one that, again, it probably different to you. I didn't have a Roger Ebert or a Pauline Kael that was I mean, I've read their stuff, but since kind of like I became interested in film, and it's definitely from an academic standpoint. I mean, the first sort of writer and film book that I really sort of gravitated towards when I went to university was a book called Camera Politica by Douglas Kellner and Michael Ryan. And it just sort of showed how sophisticated film writing could be, particularly in a sense of ideological criticism about films and how they relate to politics. And then I got into, people might roll their eyes who know these writers, but people like Frederick Jameson and Michel Foucault, very sort of postmodernist writers who informed my my PhD. But then I really loved just kind of in a reading sense, people like Susan Sontag and Roland Barthes, John Berger. The masculinity stuff, Steve Neal, I remember his book Masculinity on Spectacle, Masculinity as Spectacle was a big book, and then writers like Yvonne Tasker, Stephen Cohen, and In Ray Hark, their Screening the Male book was really influential. But going back before that, I mean, it was TV critics for me. Probably Barry Norman, Alex Cox, and Mark Cousins, and when Barry Norman doing the film show on the BBC One, and then Movie Drome, of course, which we've talked about. So those are probably the ones historically that I would point to.
Yeah, and similar for me. I mean, I didn't have, I never didn't read any of the big ones till university or beyond, like Keel and Saris and Ebert, and it was Barry Norman for me as well, who was the first critic that I really responded to, and just enjoy. I just love watching that show, and then Cox and Cousins as I got a bit older and kind of watching late night terrestrial TV in the UK. When I went to university, it kind of changed, and the first book that I really loved, academic sort of criticism book that I loved, was Peter Bondanella's History of Italian Cinema. Because I really loved the Italian cinema, the National Cinemas module, and it was Italian cinema. I'll talk a little bit more about one of those films later. But I really loved that book, just the history and thought and ideas kind of all kind of working together. And I started reading Time Out at the time, because the homework was always like watch movies, so it had TV listings but it also had cinema listings, and I was studying in London. So, and Jeff Andrew was a critic that I really loved, because he loved all the same movies that I did, as that, was I was getting into American indie cinema, and he was a big champion of Jarmusch and Soderbergh and Hal Hartley and people like that, and introduced me to a lot of filmmakers I still really love. And the other one I did want to mention was who was a tutor, so academic and a lecturer, called Peter Matthews, who also at the time wrote for Sight and Sound, and it was just thrilling to be taught by someone who, and then read their writing, and to understand that. And we'll talk about this later on as well, but like criticism, academia, cinephilia, and how blurry those lines often are. And it was, he introduced me to some really great queer cinema and kind of mainstream cinema, such as Douglas Sirk, when he taught the melodrama module. And he's the person who tried to get me into Fassbinder, and I just like, nah, I'm not. But then he was the first person I thought of years and years later when I watched more Fassbinder, and I remember how he talked about it, and how he would write about cinema, and just it was such a nice memory, and kind of remembered actually that was, at the time I didn't realise how formative it was, but just that the different perspective and the care that he gave to the thinking about film was really, really imprinting.
Yeah, I did. To be honest, I had a similar thing up at Sheffield Hallam, and sort of to read and then be taught by Tom Ryle and Frank Krupnick and Catherine Constable and Sheldon Hall and Mark Shield. All those guys were publishing, and they were sort of this part of this, probably the second movement of British film criticism. So yeah, that was really influential without a doubt. And to be honest, when I just pinged into my head really was Peter Biskind, Easy Rider's Raging Bull. That's probably the first out and out film book I read cover to cover.
Yeah.
I would probably say.
Yeah, no, that was a big influence as well. Again, just for all of that, all of those movies that were so important, and having that kind of dynamic writing about it was just, it was exhilarating.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Andrew, for your contribution there. So now we're going to move on to 3 contributions from some of our listeners and friends. We've got Marbell, who runs the site Director's Notes, Ryan Gilby, film critic for The New Statesman, and the musician Gweno, talking about why they like the podcast and some of the episodes that have stuck with them the most. And we'll be back after their contributions for a little kind of chat about what they have to say.
Hi Neil and Dario, Marbell from Director's Notes here, wishing you a happy 100th episode of the Cinematologists, which has been a constant in my podcast player since you launched 5 years ago. There are a lot of favourite episodes I could point to, such as your unranked year-end reviews, film festival wrap-ups from the likes of Berlin or London, episode 70 being a particularly great one in my opinion. However, I'd like to brag about my long-time listener status by highlighting episode 17 from your first year and the discussion you had with Dr. Catherine Grant, founder of the Film Studies for Free online archive and champion of the video essay form, who very much leads by impressive example through her own work. If the world doesn't end before then, here's to another 100 episodes.
Hi Neil, hi Dario, this is Ryan Gilby from The New Statesman. Just wanted to say congratulations on the 100th episode. I think one of the elements I appreciate most in the podcast is the way that your personalities and your friendship and your curiosity feed into the way that you talk about cinema and the way that you do interviews. I really loved being given the chance to introduce Clueless, one of my favourite films, to an audience in Falmouth, and then for our discussion afterwards to be on the podcast. But even better for me as a listener and as a cinematologist fan was the discussion afterwards that you guys had about the film and about the audience's reaction to it. Because you're such good friends, you can challenge one another without it becoming rancorous. And there's, as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of rancour in criticism. And I loved how Dario's negative response to Clueless was challenged by Neil, who I remember at one point was asking, you're happy to watch Jean-Paul Belmondo posing and brooding and freewheeling in a Godard film, and yet as soon as a teenage girl does it in a shopping mall, in a film like Clueless, it becomes kind of culturally devalued. And that was all really fascinating. It became about so much more than just the film, and just became more than just a discussion about Clueless. And I don't know, you just found something really sort of insightful in your differing responses to the film. And I think that's typical for me of the way that you guys interrogate one another's responses, and it makes us as listeners think about our own reactions and do the same. So all I wanted to say really was just keep doing what you're doing, keep digging, and here's to another 100.
Dithda, this is Gwenno. Congratulations, Keslowena, to everyone at the Cinematologist for reaching your 100th episode. My favourite moment episode was episode 40, Feminist Surrealism and Film, with Dr. Sabina Stent and Dr. Felicity G. It was a brilliant introduction to a vast subject, and Maya Deren was a revelation to me. I'm ashamed to say that I hadn't come across her work before listening to this episode. So a huge thank you for opening another door, and I would urge anyone who hasn't listened to that episode in particular to have a listen. It's brilliant.
So lots of interesting stuff there that we can talk about. I mean, first of all, just this discussion on the balance between mainstream, art house and other types of filmmaking, because obviously there's not only those two, although sometimes those are the two that kind of get mentioned as a sort of binary encompassing everything. But we do try to be as wide as we can in terms of the types of films and the types of film themes that we talk about. I mean, what's your sense of how that's happened and how we've done it?
I think it kind of goes back a little bit to what you were saying earlier about the almost being at a slower pace than a lot of other podcasts, and I think that never feeling in a rush to comment or to cover something has left us in this interesting space of, well, what do we actually want to do? And Gwenno talked there about the surrealism and female experimental filmmaker episode, which, like so many of our episodes, have just come out of an opportunity that's been offered, and the fact that we can just say, yeah, let's let's do this, and never feeling like we have to know a lot about something.
Yeah, that helps.
To do an episode on it, and to want to bring people in to talk about it. It was interesting when I met Gwenno only recently, and she sort of said about that episode, and one of the things she loved about the episode as well was that we gave Felicity and Sabina space to feel confident that when I said something stupid or unformed or in the moment, they could just say, no, that's wrong, but because I'm not trying to tell them, I'm kind of trying, I want to find out more. When we're bringing people on in any capacity, we always want to learn more. I think of the essay film one as well. It's like, well, just a great opportunity to learn more about essay films, which have always sat in the periphery of my viewing knowledge and understanding. But here's a chance where we're being invited to do something, and we can talk about it. But also, it shifts the other way in terms of your interest in sci-fi and wanting to seeing Blade Runner, and then it's like, I need to talk about this. So it is a kind of a showcase of our taste in terms and our interest, but also I hope that it's a space where we show that we are just interested, and that whatever people want us to talk about, as long as we feel like we can not just offer an opinion but offer a way of talking about it that will be of value. I think that we'll try and do it, which I think has served us well, and I think that's why people like it, because I think that it's you never really know what you're going to get a lot of the time, because we don't know what we're going to get. We don't know how we're going to feel about the films, we don't know what we're going to have to say, and so much of it is us trying to work out a way of talking about it in the moment, as we kind of respond to stuff.
I think the one thing I would just add to that is the question of when we go mainstream and which films we go mainstream on. And I think that there's always a sort of, in my mind anyway, there's always a clear target of not deliberately jumping on a specific bandwagon at a moment. I mean, there's times where we've done it, but I think that there's been always a sort of justification behind that. I mean, the big one is, I do want to talk about this at this moment. That's right. And then I think when we've done,
but just to cut in there, sorry, but that's why the bonus has been great as well. We do a lot of that on the bonus stuff because we know that it's a way to get it out and for people to listen to.
And I think when we've done new films, I think they have been new films that have been warranting exposure when maybe they didn't already have it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's just that thing of some things don't need to be added to, and therefore other people can do it. It's like, I have been asked, when are you going to do Tarantino? And it's like, we don't really need to add to that. There's other places that have done that and will do that, and we don't really need to add to it. So let's just do something else and do what we want to do.
Yeah. Well, I shared that thing from Vague Visage recently, didn't I, on the why criticism with you, which was, why write a 250-word appraisal of Rafifi by Dassan when you can just shout about how problematic the ending of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is. And I think that we've, and like, I think a lot of the new films we have chosen have been because we think, well, we know we might get 25 people actually buying a ticket or renting it, at least, and hopefully more, but that there's going to be a core audience who are going to go and seek it out, which just feels like you're doing something of real value for those filmmakers and for those films, even when you don't necessarily like them as much, but you can see that they deserve an audience as much as the big stuff does. So and then I sort of mentioned it there in terms of our thinking of the podcast, but you've got kind of very kind of specific ideas in terms of what podcasting is as a kind of tool for criticism, particularly in relation to video essays, which kind of Marvin talked about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, this, about the relationship between cinephilia, film criticism in a popular sense, and then film academia. And I think, we're just always trying to mess around with those boundaries and cut across them and bring them. I mean, again, at this point, it's difficult to see for me what the difference between cinephilia and film academia is, apart from the fact that you can be a cinephile and not necessarily teach in a university or in a school or whatever. But you know,
is it economic?
Is that the difference?
Like,
yeah, absolutely. So again, I think that any film academic who says, "Oh, I'm a film academic, but I'm not a cinephilia," I would be like, "Oh, that just wouldn't make sense to me," you know. But interestingly, in terms of the question about the video essays, and obviously Catherine Grant has been on and has been a big supporter of the show, who Marbell mentioned, and I think that's an area I definitely want to kind of move into more. I've got a bigger one planned. I've just been messing around a little bit. I just did a little one on Holy Motors, just a little minute-long one just the other day, and yeah, really, really enjoyed putting it together quite quickly.
And it's very good.
Oh, thank you. And I've got a bigger one planned, which is actually related to sound as well, and that's, I think, the difference and the big thing that I'm working on in terms of my push more towards formally constructed podcasts like the Voice episode and other stuff I've got in mind. And I think the Voice episode works because it's about sound, it's about the voice. But I think sometimes, the great thing about podcasting is it allows that space for discussion. I think that's where its brilliant interrelationship with film is. That's what I think. Hopefully, we do. We have a productive conversation that is actually expansive of knowledge rather than just talking at each other or just interviewing. What have you got out? What is it about? Do you know what I mean? So there's a dialectic going on there. Whereas the video essay, I think, probably more of a singular critical artifact, like a review, but of course it uses the advantages of images. So it uses the tools of the medium to actually critique the medium. So there's crossovers there, but podcasting obviously has to find a way to do it without images. And actually in that finding, that struggle to find the description or to find what you want to say without the images present actually leads to something interesting, I think.
Yeah, and I think, a video essay is academic in the sense of being often thesis driven, that it's kind of working around a particular idea. And I certainly know that we're not necessarily thesis driven in the podcast, but usually there's a sense towards the end that we have a greater understanding of potential theses around certain ideas and certain things. It's there's always a focus and a structure, but it's less about this is the idea at the start, and we're just gonna kind of stay on that, and we're just gonna work in that kind of mode and use that kind of that space of a podcast to explore that. And that kind of again kind of touches on a little bit in terms of the discussion and the reflection on what Ryan was saying about creating a space where things can be challenged in the moment, and you can hear people responding, changing, working out, reframing, and in a kind of safe, constructive space. And that does feel like, when you're sort of saying it there in terms of what's written on a page and then and a video essay, it feels like it's kind of a unique thing in many ways to podcasting, particularly I think as well in terms of ours and the live format, and how there's an audience present for that, and the audience can build on it, because obviously there have been challenging interviews and challenging conversations on TV and radio, but they're not often in a space where an audience's understanding can interact with it and build on it, so it becomes this really wide kind of discursive space.
Hopefully that's something we've learned to do. It's definitely something I've learned in doing the live episodes, where it was kind of like, you never know what's going to come. So you have to be ready to sort of, maybe you want to push back, but you have to push back in a certain kind of way that acknowledges the point of view, or acknowledges at least the premise of what is being said. And just on that, I mean, it's interesting on that episode on Clueless and what you said there, that really made me have to think, and also like resist the defensiveness of that thinking. I mean, it just makes you think how politics is a hard job, really. Because like you don't always think on your feet quickly enough to be able to have a response. And I didn't have, a response on that. I mean, it's interesting because now, having gone away and thought about it, it's kind of like there are responses to that I have now. Like, for example, the idea that because that's the big the premise of the criticism that I disagree with, is that because I don't like Clueless, I reject all films and representations of teenage girls. I think that's a flawed premise reaction to that point. So John Hughes films, Mean Girls, Easy A, Heathers, Cruel Intentions, Booksmart, love all those movies. I think it's Clueless that I don't like. You know what I mean? And
but that's the thing, isn't it?
Fine,
yeah, and that's what the conversation was, wasn't it? Was like,
yeah.
You know, are you saying, you know, this representation, which is, you know, a common representation, is because of the fact that you are thinking on your feet and you're formulating stuff as you go, as we both are. You often say things in a way that makes the other person say, well, I want to know if that's what you actually mean. I want you to draw that out. Are you saying that this is it just this thing, or is it how it represents other things, you know?
Absolutely. And plus, it's interesting because as well, you've got to, the podcast shows you've got to be careful with language, because it's kind of like that idea of just offhand saying, oh, well, this is a vacuous film. And like, it's interesting because there's different ways of sort of interpreting that, isn't there? So on the one hand, I could say that I think that the comparison to sort of European art house as vacuous, again, I think that's problematic, because now sort of having reflected on it, it's the idea that, I mean, I think we were talking about Antonioni as a, you know, you're quite happy to go and watch Alain Delon swamp around Europe. And isn't that vacuous? And I think that I would say that those films are actually about vacuousness. They're talking about an implied criticism of the conditions which create those people. Whereas my problem with Clueless was that it revels and delights in the vacuousness in a way that just turns me off. However, having said that, that's not to say there are thousands of vacuous films about 40-year-old white men, because there are. And I think even in terms of the vacuousness of an experience, like a better comparison would be to say to me something like, well, you like watching Mission Impossible with Tom Cruise running around. And that's a kind of, could be considered a sort of vacuous throwaway experience. And in a sense, yeah, that's probably a closer criticism to be able to say you love that, and that has the same kind of effect as this over here.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, that could be wrong, because I think that I'm in the minority here. So many people love Clueless. You know, I'm clearly in the minority, and they get something out of it more than it just being a guilty pleasure in a sort of vacuous mode of escapism. But that, you know, it's such an interesting. It's just such an interesting idea then to be able to come at those two positions, from those two different positions, and think through all of those elements, and to get away from I'm right, you're wrong.
Yeah. I think it was Goddard and Belmondo that I was, you know, knowing your love of, and how, you know, but the point still stands. Yeah. And because it was, I think it was because you were the line between how you were talking about the character of Cher and how we've talked about the character of, you know, of Belmondo's characters in like Pierre Le Fou or Breathless. You know, it's like I can't see the difference here in your formulation. So wanting to push you to push you to not to change your mind, but to make you think, which is hopefully what, you know, is reciprocated. You know, it's like I'm not interested in getting you to like Clueless, but I've seen a moment there where you know, my knowledge of you and our experience, I think that, you know, there's a gap to exploit your thinking, and I want to hear you think more, and I want to hear you think on your feet, and I want to hear you formulate, and I want to hear you push back intellectually and find more of a way of talking about it in yourself, not to change my mind and not to change your mind, but just to hear your thoughts in a more, you know, extrapolated and formulated and considered manner, rather than just, again, which I think is something you hear a lot as well, which is like, not only are you right and I'm wrong, or vice versa, but also that, you know, what you say is sacrosanct because you've said it.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like, well, I respect what you've said. Yeah. I'm not trying to challenge what you've said on a kind of exploitative or, you know, kind of mischievous manner, you know, but I'm not gonna, I don't want to let that stand, because I think you have more to say that will be of a deeper significance than just this is this and this is this.
And then I think that's the thing that the podcast has definitely taught me, is like, again, getting past that very quick knee-jerk defensiveness and pushing past that phrase that I'm using, bad faith, or the sense that the other person has an ulterior agenda for less than genuine reasons for making this point. But because in a way that's true a lot of the time out there in the world, people do have agendas. But in art and culture, I think we've got to kind of resist that. And I think that it's definitely helped me being on the podcast in doing that, and also sort of recognizing how to push back and how to re-articulate, or even how to sort of say, well, yeah, you know, that point is fair enough, and there is no answer to that in a sense of yeah, guilty as charged. You know what I mean? It's like and I think that, you know, maybe even the simplest answer is we're all conditioned by our own sense of our identities. So you know, to a certain degree, and we can be open to other stuff, but there is always that is guiding us to some degree.
Yeah, no, I think we're aware of that, of our, like, say, taste and preference and experiences. But I do think we've always approached it from the starting point of not being afraid to say I don't know, particularly, and I think that's why the live element has been so formative in terms of how we talk about stuff, because from day one, we, like you say, we never knew what was going to come out, and we had to respond to that, and we never approached it as responding it to with you're right or wrong or this is how it is. It was like, okay, what's the shared ideas about this experience, which has always been really, really fun.
Yeah, cool. So next we have a good friend of the show, and as he'll tell you, one of our, I don't know, is there a word for our sort of Uber followers, people who were there at the very first episode in the audience? I don't know if there's a word for those guys, but James Matre was definitely one.
Yeah, well, they're cinematologists, aren't they? That's what we always said. It's a collective, it's a community. It's a collective, you know. Yes. You are, and yeah, he is one of the top cinematologists. Yes. If there is a hierarchy, which there isn't.
There isn't. There really isn't.
Yeah, so a long-time listener and supporter of the show, who can be heard across many episodes. In the early days as an audience member, and more recently as a contributor in the London Film Festival episode from last year. And yeah, this is his reflection and question for us.
Hello, my name is James Matre. Congratulations on reaching 100 episodes, guys. It's been great to follow along the way. I was in the audience for Repo Man, the very first episode, and I think in the first kind of few episodes you can even hear my voice asking questions and such. But yeah, congratulations. I wanted to kind of list a couple of my favourite episodes and talk about why I listen. Obviously, as a film graduate, it's been a great resource in terms of focusing my mind post-uni, you know, when I'm not in that environment as much, and discussing films on the daily basis. It's been really great to hear great discussion about film at kind of a high critical level. My favourite episodes are kind of anything you've done with Mark Jenkin. The Cinephilia episode you did with So Mayer and Girish Shambu was really great. My favourite episode is probably the Ghost Story episode you did. It was one I did properly with watching the film and then hearing the discussion, and then having that full response. And it was just a really beautiful episode. And I think you guys did some really great work there. In terms of a question or a point of discussion, I wanted to hear about your favourite cinemas and your favourite cinema going experiences. We're in a climate at the moment where a lot of cinemas are kind of facing a feat of struggle, you know, with the virus and everything. It's going to be interesting to see how cinemas can get back on their feet. So I think it'd be a really nice time to just kind of hear a very general discussion about your favourite cinemas around the world and the favourite times you've seen movies there. Cheers then, guys. All the best.
Great. So thanks, James, again for the continued support, and we'll have you back on very soon for sure. And a great question. So favourite cinemas around the world, and maybe I don't know if you can remember seeing anything there. All blurs into one for me a lot of the time, what I actually saw, but where do you like to be to watch films, Neil?
Anywhere, really, is what I've realised.
Especially now.
Yeah. Well, even now, yeah. I mean, I could have done a home viewing one, and I will talk a little bit later on about VHS, but yeah, just loads. And I've had a lot of fun with this. I'm just going to rattle through a load, because I've got quite a few. So the ABC in Luton, which was one of my first my first ever cinematic experience, my first ever memory. One of my earliest memories was seeing E.T. and I remember two images from E.T. from being about 3, but I remember the bus ride and my dad taking me in my dressing gown as a kid, and we had my slippers in a bag, and I just remember the bus ride and the whole feeling of the space, and that really is the kind of, that is the earliest memory I have. And I still feel it, and it's so important. And that was a cinema that I saw so many great things in. And one of my favourite ones was finishing work and getting the bus and kind of running through the streets to catch the beginning of Train Spotting on opening night, and then kind of literally running in just as the film started and having Ewan McGregor run at me. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that kind of juxtaposition, which was amazing. Seeing Natural Born Killers at a drive-in in Portland in 1994 on opening night, and then obviously it was banned in the UK, so I'd seen it in this amazing experience, and it was a perfect drive-in movie. And then kind of being able to recall that and talk to people about it for months until it was available to be seen. Anthology Film Archives in New York, where I saw The Killing on 16mm in 1999. The Metrograph on my last trip to New York, where I saw Parting Glances. Any other New York cinemas? I think that was it. The Empire in Leicester Square, I saw The Master on 70mm. The Palast at the Berlinale.
Nice.
The Amazing Grace press screening, and the Corriere with you this year. Two of my favourite cinema experiences. The Close-Up Centre in East London, where I saw opening night, the Cassavetes on 35mm, which is the film that made Wilderness possible. Seeing El Gran Buck Howard, the Grand Buck Howard, which is on DVD in a cinema in Cuba, which was a very strange experience. And two more, New Lynn Film House, which is my local cinema now, seeing One More Time with Feeling, the Nick Cave documentary with my wife, and just being kind of completely overwhelmed. If Beale Street Could Talk, seeing Patterson with you there, and then the double bill of Transit and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood last summer, which was fantastic. And then finally the Curzon Soho, which is a cinema which means so much to me, not just as a viewer but as a filmmaker. Cast a lot of my films there and screened films there. Joe Strummer Film Festival, my first ever short played there in front of Plan 9 from Outer Space, and I was back there with another short in January, and again seen so many movies there, my own and others, and just it's a great space for cinema. So you might have to slow that down to get all of those, but it was a question that really kind of definitely. So thank you, James, for that
Wow.
question.
That inspired you for sure. Brilliant. So I've got a few that have got films attached to them, but a lot of just venues that I like anyway. But I suppose, sort of growing up in Leeds, there's two big venues. There's the Odeon on the corner and the ABC in Leeds. And the Odeon's a funny one because I used to meet my old man there because my parents were divorced, and that we used to meet outside the Odeon in the corner of Leeds, which is gone now. And it just holds this sort of memory, just as a sort of space of identity as much as anything else. You know what I mean? I mean, anybody who's sort of us men, we have difficult relationships with our fathers anyway, but as a child of divorce, that sort of has a really significant place in my sort of memory of where I'm from and all that kind of thing. But then the ABC in Leeds is where I saw Superman in 78 for the first time. And I think that's probably my earliest cinematic memory, and just, I mean, unbelievable experience, I think. I mean, obviously, it's so many years ago, you can't really put into words what it probably was like, but I do remember being there. Then going to university and going to the showroom in Sheffield, and I think the first film we saw there as a sort of cohort was Fight Club. And I just remember coming out of Fight Club, and we all went in the bar, and it's the first time I sort of thought, I'm a real sort of academic here discussing films after coming out of the coming out, and why people liked it, why people didn't like it, and that kind of thing. And in Leeds again, the Hyde Park Picture House, which I kind of got into going to when I was moving to that area of the city, and it was a very sort of small, old school art house cinema. And it was when I first realised that there were sort of different types of cinemas. Really, it didn't sort of register, I don't think, until that point. In London, I love going to the Curzon Aldgate. I think it's the most sort of undiscovered cinema in London in terms, I mean, it's part of the Curzon chain, and Soho is great as well, and I go to Bloomsbury a lot, but there's just something about Curzon because it's always quiet. So I don't know whether I should be sharing this, but it's a great place to go for if you want to really focus on something. And seen lots of stuff there. Ad Astra and High Life both saw there, which was great. Screen on the Green, really good, just down the road now from where I live in Islington. I like going to the BFI, so whenever stuff is on there, it's really nice. It was great. Just was at the Q&A between Mark Kermode and Tilda Swinton, which was good fun. Always try to get to the chats when I can. And then, of course, in Berlin, and just, in terms of the films, is almost... it's not inconsequential, but I just love going to the international, and I loved it when that film was referenced in Atomic Blonde. With Charlize Theron has a great scene of her sort of walking past it with the big poster of Solaris on the front, which I really like that film. It's an underappreciated film, I think, Atomic Blonde. I really liked it. And then the Colosseum in Berlin, which is out to the east of the city, and it just sort of does remind me of, you know, I mean, again, I don't want to sort of overtly romanticize the idea of the history of Berlin, but, you know, the different architectural schools, I think, can be appreciated despite the history that they come out of. But yeah, the Colosseum in Berlin is a great place to see films, because it's one of those long, thin screening rooms rather than the big, flat, wide ones. So great, yeah.
Great. Lovely question, James. Thanks for that. You also wanted to talk about I guess a bit more about the podcast in terms of people's listening, because he mentioned there about Ghost Story, where he, you know, listen to us, watch the film, listen to us, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just funny, interesting that I think that was my sort of feeling about my intention about how to structure the podcast early on, when we were cutting between doing an intro and a Q&A, and even on some of the earlier episodes you can hear me sort of saying, now's the time to put the film on if you're listening at home. And it's funny, I just think I realized quite quickly that you cannot control how the audience uses the media that is out there. So it's almost kind of like we gave that up and just went, yeah, here's the podcast, you listen to it however you want, and if you want to sync it up with the film. But it's just one of those great unknowns, I think, isn't it, about how audiences, I mean, there's so many times in the last 3 or 4 years that people have come up to me and said, yeah, I've liked this episode and I listened to that. And even when just people come up and say, oh yeah, I love the podcast, it just blows me away every time anyway.
Yeah, and you realise that there are so many different variations of it, you know, the kind of doing it in that sense. Some people just listening to it to listen to how we're going to talk about something that they know well. Sometimes to, kind of to be introduced to stuff. Sometimes just for the experience of listening to people talk about films, and then, you know, whatever kind of comes out of that. It's kind of, it's really refreshing. And I think, you know, that I know some people listen to shows that only when they don't know the films, to learn about the film, rather, you know, because even though there's 100, which isn't a lot compared to, like you say, a lot of podcasts, they're quite long. They are an investment, which we understand and appreciate in terms of the length of time to listen. And some people just think, well, I know that film quite well, happy, you know, but I don't know this one, so they'll pick one that they don't know, or it'll be the comfort of us talking about something they do know. And I think that, because again, going back to this idea of our approach to the types of films we want to talk about and the type of filmmakers we want to speak to, there is a kind of something for everyone at some point, and people know that's going to come round. So that's been another positive part of it. It's all positive, isn't it? It's all good so far.
Yes, it's all good. It's all good. Great. So moving on, you've got a question that was submitted by one of your students.
Yeah, so Lottie, who's also a Patreon subscriber, just wanted us to talk about... so thank you, Lottie. Just wanted us to talk about Lars and the Real Girl more, because it's a film that she really, really loves. Well, I'm happy to do that. I did think, you know, what was it about Lars and the Real Girl that kind of, you know, what did I most get out of that experience? It was a film that I wrote about for Beneficial Shock when I was doing I was asked to do a feature on unconventional love stories, and I wrote a feature on her, Harold and Maude, and Lars and the Real Girl. And it was easy to do her and Harold and Maude because they're both films I'd seen and loved and had a lot to say about in that specific context. But I hadn't seen Lars and the Real Girl. And often when commissioned to do stuff, you're asked to write about films that you haven't seen. And the last time I'd done that was a few years ago for the Directory of World Cinema. I was asked to write about Manchester movies. And two of the films that I had to really focus on I hadn't seen. One was Charlie Bubbles, the Albert Finney directed movie, which I loved, and I was so happy to be introduced to that movie. And the other one was David Lean's Hobson's Choice, which just left me completely cold. I just found it completely staid and just kind of going through the motions. So this was another one I was like, how am I going to... And it was a film I had avoided seeing, Lars and the Real Girl, because I thought this is going to be twee, kind of, you know, just affected kind of indie. And I just, at the time, I wasn't really into, and I just, I like Ryan Gosling, but not not a complete disciple of him. So I sat down with an open mind thinking, okay, and I was absolutely kind of dumbstruck by it, and I just found it a really, really moving film and a really smart film. And it really took me by surprise. And I was like, okay, I did not give this the credit that it deserved. And a lot of that's marketing, but also my kind of prejudice. Yeah. And it was really rewarding to be able to write about a film fresh and not, just kind of really, really get into it and be kind of taken away from it. So it's nice that Lottie asked. And I did quickly read the piece. And one of the things I realised that I wrote about, or I didn't write about, was, but it's kind of referenced, is this idea of what normal is.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. No, it's just like that. I agreed with that. What you were saying, it's like that idea of one of the things that I think films do that work on a level of, I don't want to say, politics is an easy thing to say, but actually, there's that question of do films matter anymore? But that idea of, I mean, I had quite a conservative upbringing, and I think that what films has helped, what great films that I've loved or have changed me, have helped me to do, is sort of see something that maybe from the outset I would have gone, well, that's I don't agree with that, or that's just out and out strange. You are abnormal for being like that. And to take a subject like that and actually, look at the ins and outs of it, and sort of, actually this person is a human being and is having and thinks and has an experience in this way. And it's interesting how films allow you to sort of go in and out of the difficulties and the contradictions of that to get to a place where you're like, oh, actually, this is not a straightforward, this guy's weird kind of thing. Yeah,
and it says a lot about the industry of film, because within the film itself, it's complex and nuanced. But you just know that reaction that you're talking about there is often the reaction of the people who have made the film in a commercial sense, and then they want to. They're like, well, we can't distribute it like that, so we'll reduce it to being, Ryan Gosling, buys a sex doll and kind of, has a weird relationship with it. And it's like, well, yeah, that's a small part of the plot, but you can see those decisions and that fear and that, like, I don't understand this, so I'm going to reduce it to this. And then that puts people off. It certainly put me off, because I was like, I'm not sure I fancy that. And then when I see the film, I'm like, oh, okay, this is not the film that's been advertised. And it was so great. So yeah, thank you for asking about that, Lottie. And yeah, kind of, I loved the way in the film he was asked to live a kind of with a definition of a label. Like everyone wants him to be normal, and he never says it, but he doesn't really understand what normal is. And kind of presents something abnormal as normal, to say what is normal. And it's a kind of consciousness. It's an act where he's working through his own mental health issues, but also highlighting, what people's projection, which is all well-meaning and kind of thoughtful and considerate, how misplaced it can be in terms of the subject not understanding what the question is or what the task is, and kind of putting it back on those people and saying, okay, well, I think this is normal because I don't know what normal is. And then they deal with that as normal and they understand him better. And it's just such a clever film, and the tone of it and the way it plays out and how much time is given over to people being compassionate and understanding and working through something as a community, I think is absolutely golden. And yeah, really, really great. And then it did make me kind of what other films have surprised me. And I've realised that, it happens quite a lot, but often it's kind of small and kind of nice. And I think that one thing I'm quite proud of is that as the older I've got, the more, the more open-minded I've got about the kind of films I want to watch. And the podcast, like I said earlier, right at the start, has had a big part of that. And I'll kind of watch most things now, of all genres and all types, because I'm more curious as I get older than less. But what surprised me recently was when I was talking about Booksmart in an MA session, and one of the students was just absolutely flabbergasted that not only had I seen it, but that I had liked it.
Right, yeah.
Which kind of makes me realise, it's kind of rare for people, particularly our age, to like new things or things that are considered for a different kind of audience. And that still surprises me that people, and sometimes I do it just to get a reaction when I tell them like certain things, because I know that their assumption as students is that, oh, Neil's not going to dig that, or even if he says he is, he's going to be the old, oh, I dig the hip hop, kind of like. But when I want to talk about it, I want to talk about Booksmart and its representation of friendship and its representation of, coming of age and because I just thought it was great, and that was a surprise in the sense of it'd been talked about a lot, but it's still right. And what surprised me about that was how funny it was. Like, that was genuinely funny.
It's fucking hilarious. I mean, that was the film that I mentioned there on the list. It was just like that really, really surprised me, because I did think maybe it's going to be, by the numbers stuff that we've seen before, but I really think it does some interesting stuff there, and again, it's a pity it didn't get seen more. But yeah, that sense of being surprised and being curious, I think, are in tandem, aren't they? And I think, it's sometimes, again, without generalizing, that sometimes you wish that students were a little bit more like that. You know what I mean? You've almost got. I mean, it's our job. We've got to kind of get them interested and curious in things, but sometimes you wish that they come a little bit more with that. And so on. I think maybe it is to do with the way that culture is kind of delivered to them.
But I think if we're curious, it helps. I do believe that, if we show them that we're curious about what they like, then I think that, and then that did happen sort of later on when I showed Moonlight, which none of them had seen. I showed the Diner clip, and they were open to it, because they were like, well, Neil likes Booksmart. They're small things, but I do think that kind of curiosity is what you said earlier about the kind of the cinephilia academia blend. I think there's a real value, and not to judge other people who don't, but I think there's a real value in being open to the entire experience of cinema as a way of showing people just the array of stuff that's out there, and not saying you must like this, but that there are other things that you might like, and it's kind of developing that curiosity, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, it's great when that happens. I mean, the biggest one for me, I just know that straight away. The film that surprised me more than anything else was Holy Motors, which I've mentioned, in nauseous detail a lot on the podcast, but just
every episode I get so much.
Yeah, maybe so. But it is just that thing of, oh yeah, here's this festival film. I've never, to be honest, I'd never heard of the filmmaker up to that point. It's one of my blind spots. Went in, watched it, and was just like, that was it for the rest of the festival. I just thought about nothing else, and it's like, that is unbelievable. And then, I remember when we went to see Frank in the early days, and that was a film that really surprised me. And when I was watching it, I was like, oh, I bet Neil loves this, because you were sat sort of three ways. I was like, yeah, this is really, really great. And what surprised me is how a film kind of is very difficult, I think, to create a sort of band, a believable cult band that doesn't actually exist previously. And they just managed to do that. And then, I mean, again, you're a big Jarmusch guy, and you've got a history of that. But then just to see Patterson when we watched it, and just be, film of the year for me that year, and just loved it so much, not expecting for that to happen.
And the same as, again, kind of, I wasn't expecting it to do what it did. But one of the nice surprises of this podcast was when I got Julian Temple down here, and I was really interested in how you take to The Future as Unwritten, not because you'd be anti it, but because of, you have sort of talked on the podcast a lot about how music's not and because I'm so connected to the music, I wonder what it says outside of that. And it was so great that you enjoyed it, but also that you could see things in it that I couldn't see as much because of my association with it, and that was a nice surprise that you responded to it the way you did, and that you then kind of helped me see things in it that are kind of not obscured, but kind of, I'm always kind of leaning towards certain aspects of it because of the music and what the music means to me.
Great. So who's up next?
Next we've got Ren Zelen and her contribution, which also includes a question, which we will get to after this. So thank you, Ren, and here she is.
Hi, I'm Ren Zelen. I'm a freelance film reviewer, academic editor, and occasional writer of post-apocalyptic science fiction. I discovered the Cinematologists podcast, hosted by academics Dario Linares and Neil Fox, several years ago now, and I was immediately intrigued and engaged. Theirs is a podcast that manages to offer an entertaining mix of lively, informal chat with informative and insightful discussions on all matters related to film. The Cinematologist podcast has deservedly gone from strength to strength, becoming a favourite with cinephiles. Dario and Neil offer illumination and food for thought, but they also provide advice to anyone who might be thinking about how to create a wide-ranging, zippy podcast. And that is advice that is particularly useful in these extraordinary times. I suppose what we might need to discuss now is how we watch films in isolation, or the various ways we might be able to reclaim watching films as a group activity while we're in isolation. Anyway, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to congratulate Dario and Neil on their 100th episode, and I'm looking forward to continued listening. Here's to the next 100 Cinematologist podcasts.
Thank you, Ren, for taking the time and sending us that little clip. Really appreciated. Dario, watching films in isolation versus reclaiming film watching as a group activity. It's the hot question on the lips and ears and eyes of every cinephile in the lockdown.
And it's actually going to become more and more of a question, I think, going forward. I mean, I don't know how cinemas are going to deal with this for the next however long, 6 months, a year, 18 months. I mean, are people going to even go if social distancing is relaxed? Are cinemas going to be able to operate if they can only put so many people in there? So these are really fundamental questions, and I think just judging by seeing some of the articles and social media posts that I've seen, I think people are realizing what they've missed, and I think that there is a sort of move towards trying to manufacture some experiences, whether it's Netflix Party or using other sort of digital mechanisms, joining stuff on Zoom, having sort of watch-alongs and this kind of thing. But then as well, I saw that there was an article. I think it was this street in Dublin, and this guy had hooked up a projector and was screening films on the back of the house, and the whole street could watch. And it was just like, that's absolutely fantastic. And I think that sense of reclaiming the communal experience is definitely, obviously, key to cinema and the cinematic. And we've discussed a lot about that idea of what is the cinematic, and the sense of a shared experience that is enhanced or almost created through the fact that that there is some kind of sharing going on, even though you're sat in the cinema and you're on your own and the lights go down and everything like that. I mean, it's one of the intangible things about cinema, I think, is why that works. Yeah, you're alone, but you're also together. So I think it's interesting how people are kind of negotiating that in this current situation. And I just think it's great that people are still doing it and recognizing it. And to be honest, I think maybe, I've mentioned to you, I'd like to do an episode where we do that somehow using the technology going forward. So hopefully that we'll sort something out around that. But yes, it is a question, actually something I'm kind of putting something together to write about, or maybe get a project together on. I think
it's whether whether they've realized what they've missed, or whether the people who just did it kind of automatically, as a social thing, or as a thing of work, cinephiles, critics, whatever, film fans, they knew its value because they did it, but they didn't understand it and they couldn't articulate it. And this has kind of, again, created space, but also made people really think about what it is that they like about it. Not that I think there's a lot of people who realise, actually, I haven't stopped going to the cinema and I kind of took it for granted. But I think there's equally a lot of people who did go automatically, but took it for granted in the moment and didn't realise what it was that, And I think one of the reflections that's come out is why people like cinema and movies and television, and like art, really, because they're spending so much time, and that's their outlet now. That's their focus of kind of not thinking about how terrible everything is to engage with art in some form, books, TV shows, film, and cinema is such, like you say, such a specific experience in terms of the communal shared experience that I think people are really thinking about. And I guess I'm hopeful for cinema's continued relevance as an experience, but there's just the huge practicalities of what is that landscape physically going to look like at the end of it, because who's going to survive, who is going to be left, and a lot of those cinemas which we talked about when James asked us, will they be there, because it's like, how can they survive? A multiplex will be okay, or something will come in its place, but it's it's those other experiences that are at risk, not through apathy anymore, just through the financial and economic reality of not being able to let people through the door, and that is really sad and really tragic and really worrying, because they're not just movies. They are important. There are things that are more important, but they are important to us as human beings, and as communal things, but also as kind of individual experiences on a big screen. I've got a new telly, and it's amazing. Like it's not much bigger, but the picture's so much better. But even then, last night I was watching a film and I was thinking, God, that just the ability to kind of just get into it because of the terms of the technical facility to project and kind of just hit me in a certain way is kind of, and then it's like, God, like what would this be like in a cinema, where it's just so much more, and then you do remember, actually, there's something really, really meaningful about it. And if that's lost outside of, the kind of fast food conveyor belt experience, that will be really sad. And I hope that there's still a landscape when we come out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe that's one of the things that we'll have to talk about in terms of our live episodes that we may be able to do in the future, and really think about supporting, small cinemas and offering to put programs on, around the podcast.
Definitely something I've thought about as well. Kind of wanting to get back out there and do that for those places.
Great. Yeah, that's definitely a subject we're going to be coming back to in future episodes, I have no doubt.
So we can take a bit of a break now and settle in for our next contribution. Our next guest did not really listen to our brief of a couple of minutes.
He's an experimental filmmaker. What do you want?
And now he's a BAFTA winner. He'll just he can just do whatever he wants, and we'll just happily accept it. So if you couldn't guess from those cryptic clues, the next contributor is Mark Jenkin, and he's got a lot to say about a lot of things. So here he goes.
Hello, cinematologists. I'm speaking to you from a homemade voiceover booth in our attic, where Mary, my partner, is hopefully going to be continuing the part of her career where she records audiobooks remotely. So hopefully this is quite a dead sound you're getting here. So yes, having been asked to say a few things about the cinematologists, here goes. I think at this time, especially during isolation, I think podcasts reveal their true value, and I've been listening to a huge amount of stuff. And I think the Cinematologist podcast was one of the first that I really got into. And I remember when Neil and Dario, when they were both working together at, I don't know why I'm talking about you in those terms, actually, because I'm talking to you, really. But I remember when you first came up with the idea, and I think it was when, it was, Dario, when you were still at Falmouth teaching. And the early discussions were about it being a radio show, which was very exciting. But then for whatever reason, I don't know exactly the ins and outs of it, but it became a podcast, and I think it's become a real essential podcast. And at the beginning, I suppose, for me, there was a bit of a novelty value to it, because I knew both the people who were hosting it. But I think it then, certainly for me, became an essential podcast, because it kind of fills the gap, bridges that gap between the film viewer, consumer, and sort of the film academia that I dip a toe into. And it really does something that no other podcast really does. You have much more mainstream podcasts that serve a certain purpose, but the cinematologists have always been there for sort of away from what's going on, sort of contemporary trends. Is more of a sort of more of a objective view of incredibly subjective, but I suppose not caught up too much in the day-to-day film world, not reviewing weekly releases and that kind of thing. So more timeless in that sense, and incredibly random. So no real pattern, no idea what's going to come next, no idea who the next guest is going to be, and really no real sense of where it's going thematically, which sounds like a criticism, but actually that's really great, because you're never quite sure what you're going to get, and some things will be familiar to me, and some things will be great unknowns, which then it starts serving as a podcast that introduced me to things that otherwise I wouldn't have known about. So I'm very grateful that the Cinematologist podcast exists. Very grateful for your hard work, Neil and Dario. It's a brilliant podcast, and more importantly, it's an essential podcast. Now, the second bit of what you asked me to think about, what would be a good discussion to have, and here goes. So recently I've been thinking a lot about luck, and a lot about luck when it comes to timing. So my film Bait, which has become a critical and commercial success in the context of British independent film. I often wonder why, and I think a lot of it comes down to, or a certain amount of that success is due to good timing, and I've spoken about this before, but it all goes back to Berlin last year, when we got a first look review from Peter Bradshaw at the Berlinale, and everything really started from that good review. And I think the reason he gave that good review, or partly why he gave that good review, was because he very publicly said that year's Berlinale was weak, certainly the first few days, and along came this film that he knew nothing about, which was Bait, and really took him by surprise. And I think maybe if the beginning of the Berlinale had been stronger in his eyes, then maybe that review wouldn't have been written. He might not have seen the film. He certainly might not have been so vocal about his support for it, and we wouldn't have got that momentum going, which has really carried the film ever since. Now, it's not to say that it isn't a great film or anything, and other people's reviews are incredibly important. I would cite your support of the film. Also, Mark Kermode's very vocal and public support of the film. But it does go back to that Berlinale where I do think we were a little bit lucky with the timing. Fast forward to now, and it's really heartbreaking to read a lot of stories of filmmakers who'd worked on their movies to get them finished and were just about to premiere them. I know of a few people who were going to have world premieres at South by Southwest, for example, who just, when it got pulled, understandably, that moment for them just disappears, and it's incredibly bad luck. And fingers crossed those films get that moment, and they get their exposure, and people get to see them maybe in this new world of streaming films online first. Hopefully they do get that limelight, and they do get a fighting chance to reach an audience. But it does make me very thankful for the timing of Bait, and I was just about to start shooting a new film, and we've had to push it back a year, which is pretty heartbreaking. But again, we kind of benefited from good timing again, because the finance is effectively in place for the film, but we hadn't started spending any money or shooting. So for us, the film being mothballed at this moment, the timing couldn't have really been better. So again, it's just really thankful for our luck with regard to timing. And no films that were shooting and only a few days away from wrapping that got shut down, and that must be. And I don't think anybody, unless you're Paul Schrader, I don't think anybody kind of questions that. But it must be so difficult to deal with if you're just about to finish shooting and the world shuts down. How do you pick that up again? How do you get going with that momentum, especially if the whole world's changed by the time you get back to making a film? And also people who were beginning to structure deals to get films into production where nothing had been signed on the dotted line, and then the world shut down. What happens to those projects, those people who were so far through development and were just about to get greenlit? So my question really is to do with that. My question for the cinematologist. And the other day I was asked by the Clevedon Curzon Cinema to do a little thing for them about key cinematic experiences. And I thought about what my key cinematic experiences were. And one thing that sprung to mind was to do with timing and a twist of fate. What I said to them that a key cinematic moment for me was when I was 10, I went to cinema with my dad. He wanted to take me to see Crocodile Dundee, and we went to the local cinema, and it was a 15. I think it was 1985, 1986. I was about 10, and it was a 15. So they wouldn't let me in to see Crocodile Dundee, and me and my dad were both completely gutted by this. But on screen 2, there was a film that was a PG, and so because we'd gone all the way to the cinema, we went into the other screen and watched that film, and it was The Mission, Roland Joffe's The Mission, which I knew nothing about. My dad didn't know anything about it either, and amidst the disappointment of not getting to see Crocodile Dundee, we sat and watched The Mission, and it completely blew me away. I didn't know anything about it. It's probably the first time I'd ever been to see a film that I didn't know anything about, and it really moved me, and it traumatised me. I think it probably even bored me at times. It made me angry. It made me feel all of these things that I probably hadn't felt in a cinema before. And when we left at the end and drove home, it just kept playing. The film kept playing, and there's images from that film that still stick with me now. And I often wonder what would have happened if we'd been allowed to go in and see Crocodile Dundee, whether in a parallel universe there is a version of me who did get to see Crocodile Dundee when I was 10, and I wonder whether that version of me is a filmmaker or doing something completely different. So I think my question for you guys, cinematologists, is what are those defining moments for you in your cinema watching, your film watching life, that all come down to chance, timing, fate, whatever it is that meant that you've ended up where you are now. And if those events didn't happen, do you think you would have still got here? Would you still be hosting this brilliant and essential podcast? Ride on. Stay safe. See you soon. Bye.
So thanks so much, Mark, for that contribution. We're only teasing you. We'll have you on, as many minutes as you like. And we really appreciate the continued support, and someone who was there at the start as well. And yeah, it's just great to have somebody like that who's championing the podcast in the way that he does. You know what I mean? Seeing it and appreciating what we've tried to do. I found his question though on sort of the films that influenced you by luck or chance or fate or cinematic experiences that had that attached to them and then went on to influence you. I found that a really difficult one. I don't know whether I can honestly say that there was a sort of sliding doors moment, but you've picked a few, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got a few there. I did, first of all, just want to kind of pick up on the way he was talking about luck. And because I've always had a problem with the idea of luck, the way it's used, and I think the way that Mark's using it there in terms of good luck. Like, I don't think there's anything lucky about Bait. I think he's very fortunate. I think he's got good fortune, and what I mean by that is I think that for me, when people say you're lucky, it's like, yeah, there are lucky people who are just handed things, and with no conception or work or anything like that, and good things happen to people all the time that where there's no element of agency. And I think that for me, there's fortune to Bait in the sense that he worked damn hard, and he's worked hard for a long time, and also the film has to be good, and I think that's the thing is like Bradshaw could easily have watched it and thought it was terrible. Festivals are full of terrible films, or just average films, just films that are just like, particularly programmed films because of someone knows someone else. Like, the film has to be good and it has to work in that. He was fortunate that, for whatever reason, Bradshaw watched it, but he has to like it and it has to be good. And I think that, and this kind of goes into a lot of some of those films. I think that there's bad luck, and at the moment I think it's really interesting him talking about filmmakers that aren't going to be able to release their films. That's bad luck. That is out of their hands. They've done everything that they could to be in a position to do it, and they've not been able to have that opportunity, and that bad luck has taken out of their hands. But I think that there is a difference between good luck and good fortune, and I think Mark has worked so hard, and I think that a lot of filmmakers have worked hard, and that he deserves that, because it's not luck, it is talent, and it is reflection, and it is persistence, and it is it is hard work, and it's just so great that it's been rewarded in so many different ways, because he absolutely deserves it. And that's why I kind of thought about the films that have kind of shifted my direction. A lot of them have come from putting myself in a position to do that, rather than just like lucky kind of. I can't remember a lot of the films that I just sort of switched on that really had a huge impact. There's always some kind of drive to do something, but there have been a lot of surprises. It was interesting reading about The Hen in this month's Sight and Sound, and remembering seeing that video cover in the video shop where I would just rent as much as I could all the time, and seeing that cover when it first came out, thinking, what is that? And being a 18-year-old kid in Luton, looking at those faces and seeing those kind of faces every day, but never seeing them on a video cover, and never seeing them in a video cover in Luton, and just being like, I need to see this film, and absolutely being blown away by it, and thinking that was genuinely life-changing. In the days where you would go in and pick something based on its artwork on a shelf, which again is something that doesn't really happen. That was a huge one. And other VHS experiences were seeing Raising Arizona, and just thinking like, this feels strange. Like, I get it, and I liked it, but I didn't know why. And then kind of staying with me. And then seeing the Hudsucker Proxy video cover and thinking that's weird. And because I knew the guy in the video shop, I was like, well, what's this? And he was like, oh, those guys have made some films before, Raising Arizona, Blood Simple. And I was like, oh, Raising Arizona, I've seen that. And then linking that, you know, it wasn't just Spielberg and Scorsese who made films in the plural, that there were other people, and thinking, well, I remember seeing Raising Arizona, I'll try this, and just loving Hudsucker Proxy, and that formulating understanding through those ways. Mean Streets was another one where I programmed a night of Scorsese movies, and needed something to fill it. I had Goodfellas and Taxi Driver, and I needed something else, to like a marathon, so I picked Mean Streets, and I'd never seen it, and that film genuinely changed my life. I remember seeing The Conformist at university, where I was kind of in that position of, I'm here to learn, show me stuff I've not seen before, that's why I'm here. But absolutely just kind of having my axis shifted, but also understanding I've seen that somewhere else. Where have I seen that? And I'm realising, which is what I worked through in an essay, that The Godfather Part 2 and how closely it resembles and takes from The Conformist, and Coppola's kind of reimagining of The Conformist, and that, and then other things which were genuinely lucky but kind of nice was last summer in Prague. I had an afternoon, you know, that kind of classic, I've checked out, I've done my last meeting, my taxi to the airport later, what can I do? I'll go to the movies, and seeing three identical strangers in this documentary in this lovely, you know, kind of 1930s Prague picture palace, and just what a great documentary, what a fabulous film. And just the curiosity of kind of thinking, okay, well, I've got a few hours to kill, I'll go and watch a movie, I kind of heard of that, I wonder what that's like, and just being, you know, immersed and enmeshed in that experience, and just so it was a really interesting thing to think about, in terms of what drives me to watch certain things, and when are the moments where, what has put me in the position to see those things, you know, rather than just I go to the cinema every week, what do I see? But those things that have shifted my brain, and how did they come about, and who was I at that time, and what was I interested in doing and seeing, that was really valuable. So I appreciate being able to do that.
I think you're broadening out the question has helped a little bit. And I suppose, just going back to my childhood, I remember when we first got a VCR player, and that was just like a seminal moment, because it was that opportunity to take control over your own viewing a little bit more. And it's funny now, like, so, you know, we're talking about the idea of, you know, mobility and temporality in podcasting, and everybody's got autonomy over the way and how and where and when of what they watch. But just like having this metal box that played movies and recorded movies, that was the other thing. It was like, you know, something was on late at night, and you could record it and then watch it later. And that's where, you know, I started having my VHS collection with the little stickers on, you know, your Memorex tapes, and sort of keeping hold of. I remember seeing THX 1138 on Moviedrome, and just like, oh my god, what is that? And, you know, this is later on. It's funny actually. I think I remember with the VHS player, I was probably 14 when an illicit copy of Terminator went round the school, and I just remember getting hold of this copy of something that none of us were supposed to watch, you know what I mean? And like literally sort of shaking as it went in the VCR player to play it. And I, you know, had a couple of mates around, and we were just like, curtains closed, and we're recreating the cinematic experience, you know. It's just hilarious. But yeah, I remember that. And then I remember when a friend of mine, I mean, I had, again, like I said, I had quite a mainstream upbringing, so I didn't really get into sort of what you call non-mainstream or art house or cult type filmmaking till later on. And I remember a friend of mine sort of said, oh, I want to watch this film, The Breakfast Club. And I kind of like, well, what's that? Then, oh, it's these kids in school, you know what I mean? And they're in detention. I was like, what the fuck do you want to watch that for? And I said, oh, come on, let's watch it. And I just remember, like, it's probably the first time where I'd seen a film and thinking that this film takes young people's feelings seriously. And suddenly I was kind of like, you know, oh, that's I can't remember seeing that before. Yeah, film was just action and violence and all that kind of stuff. And then in terms of university, that moment of, oh, I'm here to learn, was probably when I saw Pierre Le Fou for the first time, and just kind of watching it and was like, what is this? And coming out thinking that, like, I mean, I don't want to sort of give a load of hyperbole, but it's almost kind of like the world looks slightly different now, because this I've seen it through this sort of lens, which was really kind of weird and interesting and didn't make sense, to me at the time. Maybe still doesn't now to a certain degree. But yeah, just those sort of moments I remember. But it's funny that question of, is there a moment which if you didn't land on that path, your life would have been very different. And to be honest with you, and again, it does relate to what's going on now a little bit in terms of work and stuff. It was getting my first full-time job at Falmouth University, and because what happened was I went for the interview, and then our colleague or former colleague Sarah got the job first, but then apparently the numbers went up so much that they needed a second person. I got after having got a call saying I didn't get the job, like 2 weeks later, I got a call saying I did get the job, and that roller coaster of emotions. I just remember as soon as I got the contract and signed it, was offered, I went for a walk around Leeds, you know what I mean, thinking I had to sort of let it settle in my brain about my life had now changed, and the PhD and the thing that I'd been doing for, 7 years had led to this point. And like when I see people on especially now the position that precarious work is in academia. I know precarious work applies to all situations, but I have a particular affinity for those people doing part-time teaching and doing PhDs, because I know what it's like to be there.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it is interesting to think about those moments, isn't it? I think it's important, and I had to broaden out the question because I grew up in a place where the cinema offering was so mainstream, and I saw a load of films at the cinema and loved loads of them. I remember seeing Jurassic Park and Toy Story and just thinking these are great movies, but nothing that really spoke to me in a way that suggested what I was going to do, until I saw Mean Streets, where I was like, this is, that was at college, and that was it. That was like, and then I think I read Personal Journey through movies with Scorsese, and then got into film noir through that. And I had this, talk about VHS, I had a VHS long play. You remember your long play?
Yeah.
So it was like 8 hours or whatever it was.
8 hours, yeah.
Rather than 4 hours. And on this I had The Killing, Double Indemnity, Build My Gallows High, and Touch of Evil. And I've still got the VHS. I've got it in the archive. Just like that, all these movies on one VHS in terrible quality, but it meant so much to me. And I'm seeing Rebel Without a Cause, and then there was a Nicholas Ray season on, and putting In a Lonely Place, I think Bigger Than Life, and Rebel Without a Cause on a big, and just like that was so important that those films were on TV and that we had VHS, and that it came from so many different places. And Mean Streets was a moment where it was like I started to take it seriously, but also think, actually, I think I want to do more than watch this stuff now. Like there's something else, and that's kind of shifted in many directions as a filmmaker and as a critic, and as an academic in terms of how I actually engage with that stuff. But I knew then that these are the kind of experiences I want. I want to make them. I want to have them. I want to just feel completely blown away and also connected to something. And again, like an addict, that's the high that I'm constantly searching for as we go through.
Very good, very good. But the thing we are both really waiting for, though, Neil, is obviously Mark Jenkin rebooting Crocodile Dundee. This is just the cinematic event, that the world is waiting for.
I am so excited. I know he's going to make this kind of, obscure 70s horror movie next, but I'm pretty sure that down the line, and I'd say bring back Paul Hogan as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And maybe have Ed Rowe played Martin in Bait as a kind of younger, kind of like orphaned son of, or like, kind of like has to reconnect with his dad, played by Paul Hogan, and take on the mantle of Crocodile Dundee. I can see it happening.
I thought Jackman would be in the running.
Well, I think Mark's less obvious. That's the thing.
Yeah, of course.
If he's anything. So no, I can't wait for Blockbuster Jenkin down the line. We've got one more main one, which is, we've kind of left it to the end because it's the question in it is kind of suggestive of what's next, really. So this is Dr. Kingsley Marshall, who is my colleague and was our colleague at Falmouth, and someone who has done a lot for the podcast in terms of supporting it from day one, giving it a space, giving us time, kind of encouraging us to do it, and then kind of supporting trips out and various things from day one. So he's been a real champion of the podcast.
Yeah,
and,
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add to that. Yeah, I think actually when it comes to sort of administratively, structurally in a university, I think he's probably the one person that even when we kind of didn't know what it was, he was like, yeah, go do it. And then when it became something, he was like, oh yeah, I know what it is. Then, go do it more kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And yeah, this is his contribution to our 100th episode. And yeah, we'll be back to answer or try and answer his big question.
So the call for this contribution to the 100th episode of the Cinematologists came out on the 11th of March, and it caused me to reflect a little bit on the 5 years between the launch of the podcast and that first Repo Man episode, and all the things that you learnt about the voice and podcasting, cinema, critics, reception of the audiences that you've had through the screenings, and filmmakers themselves talking about their work, and then your mediations on those filmmakers' conversations and all those many interviews you've done. But my question relates really to the difference between where we were in the UK on the 11th of March when you sent the call out, and where we are now in kind of mid to late April when I'm recording this, which is cinema, it feels, may change fundamentally post-coronavirus. We're in a moment where cinemas around the world are closed. Film and TV production is shut down globally. So I work in a film school and wondering how the students will respond to this, both in their work and in their future careers and things. So my question really is for Neil and Dario: if you project forward in 5 years and another 100 episodes, and we get to episode 200 in 2025, what will the impact of coronavirus be on cinema, how it's distributed, how it's made, and the kind of stories that we tell, and how audiences receive it? Congratulations on the centenary. It's astonishing. I remember the first conversations about the podcast, and it gives me great joy to understand how you've built an audience, an astonishing range of filmmakers and critics and contributors and fans of movies, contributing is something that's a curated selection of amazing set of movies to watch, but also a consideration of who we are and what cultural production does to us as members of a global audience. And I think that's a great achievement. You should pat yourselves on the back.
What does it look like?
I mean, we just touched on it before about the cinema going. It really is up in the air. I mean, I'm just writing a blog right now on. I mean, the newsletter entry is really a sort of collection of these almost stream of consciousness thoughts or questions more than anything else about what happens now. I mean, it cuts across so many things, because it's like, I'm back at work next week and there's a big management meeting about what's going to happen in September. But it's not just September. So, we're talking about how are we going to teach practice remotely if we're still in social isolation, which I'm absolutely sure we're still going to be. But then if there's no films being made, really, in the next 2 years, then that's going to have a massive effect on what we consider the film industry to be. And in some ways, there's kind of an interesting moment where the playing field is leveled. And again, I don't want to sort of do down and be flippant about that. I understand that like so many people have lost work and lost jobs. It's not a good thing. But on the other hand, there may be a sort of a resetting. I mean, and just to be slightly flippant for a second, is a time period without any more major blockbusters being made a good thing, an opportunity for a little bit more of a sort of look at the craft of filmmaking in a sort of more pared down minimalistic sense, which might, in the vein of Mark Jenkin, for example, provoke or inspire a new wave of creativity. That's the only sort of light at the end of the tunnel in terms of what's happening, in terms of us all being locked down in this way.
Yeah, and I think that I think that I'd go a bit further than that, and I think that there's a load of people who will be making content in a world that has to be administered very differently. So while we might not have any blockbusters on the scale of a Bond or an Avengers for a while, those places are still going to want to make content, and I just think that content through necessity might look much closer to what indie cinema or kind of cinema in different global contexts has looked like for decades.
Yes.
Because you can't have as many people make it, so fewer locations, fewer cast, more kind of pared down aesthetics, more pared down crew, and I think is an opportunity, because I think a lot of people around the world, that's how they've made films for decades and how they make films in their whole career. It's going to be a shock at the top of the industry when you can't have 100 people on a crew.
Yeah. Everyone is Jafar Panahi now.
Yeah, and I did that. I was thinking about that. Who would I show? Well, I'd show Cassavetes, and I'd show Barbara Hammer, and I'd show Jafar Panahi, and I'd show Andrew Cotting. And I'd show Nolan's first film, Following. And then going back to La Haine, Cassavetes talking about how he put the budget together for La Haine, and working with his line producer, and it's like, well, we've wasted all of our money in the first half, so the second half is essentially going to be me and 6 people with handheld and no permits running around Paris shooting this stuff, and that's an electric piece of cinema, that second half where the guys go to Paris. There's so many examples of people using restrictions, limitations as creative opportunities, and I that's what I'm excited about and hopeful for. I'm realistic to know that it's unlikely in a sense, but I think it would be interesting if there was a narrowing of that gap between an independent aesthetic and a kind of low budget punk aesthetic and what the industry is doing at the top, because I think that over time you would just kind of, even if you increased it 5-10% in terms of the types of films people watched, that's got a huge impact for indie cinema and art house cinema moving forward in the next 10, 15, 20 years if it's possible. I that's my hope, naive as it may be, but I think that as educators we can, and I sort of talked to you about this last week, I think that there is a body of work that we can show, which is the stuff we show now, but I think students are going to feel closer to it because they know that's the reality of what they can make. I think often what they have to make in a film course context is that, I have to do this because I can only have 4 people in my crew and can only use this many actors. But it's like, that's the same for everybody. That's what, that's what Paul Thomas Anderson's going to be doing. That's what Tarantino's going to be doing. That's what Catherine Bigelow's going to be doing, because that's what everyone's doing, because that's the world now. That interests me in terms of what that looks like. So I don't want to sort of be too negative, because I think it's going to be such a disaster for so many filmmakers and film companies and distributors that we know. So what's the alternative to that? And hopefully it's something we haven't quite thought of yet.
Yeah, and I think also alongside that, there's going to have to be a sort of marrying up of the filmmaking practices and aesthetics and content and the experiences that people are having, and that can be on a micro level. So what does it mean to be isolated? What does it mean to live a life that's kind of like where being online or being remote has to be sort of dealt with and utilized and underpin the way that you deal with things like work and your family and all of those kinds of things. And how can that be done in this context? And also, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this elsewhere, and it's another thing I'm interested in writing out, that hopefully disrupting the sort of ingrained biases we have about what is quality and what isn't. I think that's really important. So that sense of, when the Dogma guys came along and, in the sort of 90s, and that idea of shooting in digital video, the snobbery and the kind of like, this isn't real cinema that was attached to that, and we've had that kind of, we've gone through a bit of that when people have started shooting on iPhones and this kind of stuff. And now I think, that everybody has to kind of turn around and sort of say, okay, so how can we be creative using all of that? And not then on the... One of the good things, hopefully, on the back end, you can't kind of like say, well, you know, it wasn't shot on an Alexa 2 or whatever, you know what I mean? And it's like, no, this is great work, and all, sort of undermining that sense of snobbery, I think is really, it would be a nice thing to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. Let's hope that's how it is.
Absolutely, but we don't know. This is the thing.
Well, we don't know. We're doing what we said before. We don't. You know, we're just speculating. This is our take on it, and we've been very fortunate to be able to think about it because people have asked us. You know, and we've created a space where people want to have that conversation and want us to be part of it. That's really great. And
but what I meant by that was that, like, anybody who thinks they do know doesn't.
Oh God, yeah.
That's what I meant by that.
Don't trust anybody who says they know. And I think that chimes as well with terms of the future of the podcast. Is we don't really know what the future of the podcast is going to be.
Yeah.
Not just in a kind of post-COVID world, but just in a sense of we've never really known, and we've shaped it as best as we've gone along. It's been 5 years. It feels very good. Feels like we're doing good work that we are enjoying and that has a value. But there's going to be so many factors that kind of change that that we don't really know about for our lives as people in the field of academia that we work in, which currently we're very fortunate to have secure jobs, but 18 months of lockdown could change that. You just don't know. So kind of this has been really nice because it's a chance to enjoy it in the moment, you know, this kind of reflection and look back and appreciate what we've done before we have to embrace the uncertainty and hopefully adventure of what's next.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it's one thing sort of keeping that sense of we don't know what's going to happen. That's been the underlying principle that, you know, we like to have that sense of, what is to come? But again, that could even change again now. Are we going to start talking about things that are sort of wider than cinema? You know what I mean? Are we going to be a little bit more targeted in what we support, that kind of thing? There's all interesting questions. Are we going to try to look to engage in using more digitally available technology to create different types of episodes? I think all of those are on the agenda, or on the table, and we'll see, clearly.
And hopefully they'll all still retain the same kind of inherent experience that people have gravitated towards over the last 5 years. You know, that we'll, whatever we're doing and whatever form it takes, we're still going to be approaching it from the same position with the same goals of kind of exploring and learning and kind of sharing the experience with everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got just one more comment to come, but I just wanted to say, Neil, thanks very much for the company. It's been great. It's been formative of my last 5 years, absolutely, and the sort of glue and anchoring point of my interest in cinema and culture and life, really.
Yeah, I feel the same, and it really does sit at the centre of my kind of creative academic life. You know, it really is, so meaningful in terms of our friendship and just kind of the opportunity to do it and to have it find a space which has a value has been really rewarding. So this last kind of comment is a small one, and it should provide evidence of how, at least on a day-to-day, the podcast is seen in my house. So this is what my daughter Tessa thinks I do when I'm doing my work.
No, I do an important work called a podcast, and you must get out and go downstairs and be sad.
Thank you to Tessa for telling me exactly how much time I must spend talking about podcasting, that she now knows that it's very important work, and that I just do it all the time. So it's not just me saying I do it all the time, I clearly must do it because she's picked up on it. So yeah, that kind of wraps us up really for episode 100. It's been an absolute joy to talk to you, Dario, about all of this stuff and learn new things about you and kind of be reminded of certain things, experiences that we've shared and on the podcast and around it. This has been a really nice time.
Yep, absolutely. And thanks to everyone who's contributed to this particular episode. Thanks to everyone who has listened. Please continue to get in touch on social media. We are on Twitter, of course, Facebook, The email is cinematologists@gmail.com. We're always open, especially now more than ever, to listen to suggestions about what to talk about. I mean, we have got interviews coming up, which will go out next. But again, sometimes we haven't done one for a while where somebody suggested a film and we just talk about it. That would be nice to do.
And that might be a good way of talking about something that we can do that watching online together and recording things. So if you've got something you want us to talk about, then definitely get in touch.
Absolutely. So that has been it. That's 100 episodes. That's 5 years. This has been the Cinematologist podcast. Thanks for listening.